So I'm going to start off. Dr. John Jones may be a new face to some of us, as he recently joined the University of Illinois as an assistant professor of agronomy and soil fertility extension specialist. He said today, this is the third day this week that you've presented in this building, right? So maybe a lot of you are starting to see his face around. His emphasis is on fertilizer and soil management, soil and plant analysis, precision agriculture technologies, and minimizing nitrogen and phosphorus management practices, the impact on water quality. He is alumnus of Kansas State University and Iowa State University. He's going to talk to us about his current efforts ongoing in his lab, as well as future focus. Dr. Jones.
Thanks, Julie. I was saying yesterday, I have a fear of some stages sometimes from too many knee surgeries in college and seeing my PhD advisor actually fall off the stage when he was giving a fertility talk. So I always like to be on some solid ground. But thanks for the invitation to give this presentation today. What Julie really asked me to do was give an introduction of who I am. I've met many of you around the room here, but certainly would love to connect with everyone who we haven't had a chance to talk with yet. Things that I'm interested in working on, projects that I've got going on already, and then I will give a short, just 2 slides on a project that was funded in the fiscal year 2025 through NREC, but we do have some preliminary data from setting up the site in 2024. So really an introduction and then hopefully maybe some discussion for questions as well. Personal introduction, again, I've shown this slide 3 times this week in this building, but I originated from a small farm in Wisconsin. I hopped across a few states and did my undergraduate at Kansas State. I really cut my teeth in soil fertility work, doing phosphorus and potassium calibration at Iowa State, and quite a bit of soil, phosphorus runoff and loss work. And then I had a small research program at UW-Madison before coming down, working on nitrogen management in corn and wheat and P&K work as well. So I'll show a few examples from that work, but then also tie that into projects that are ongoing already within Illinois. So unsurprisingly, and Julie really kind of hit all these specifically in the intro, those are really the 4 buckets I would say my work kind of fits into. And I think there's really 2 guiding principles that I'm interested in making sure that are present within all of this work. One of those is to really deliver actionable solutions and data and results. So things that can integrate right into decision-making processes on the farm. Can we take these results and put them right into a VRT script so that we can use those off the charts? Is an ag retailer using the science that we're producing in their recommendation system for their own growers and agronomists and clientele? I see that as a huge win for the science that we're doing in nutrient management and something I'm really interested in. I won't show a nutrient cycle diagram, we've probably seen too many of those, but one of the things I'm really passionate about is the idea that we can operationally measure and define these, let's say, buckets or bins within a nutrient cycle pretty well. But the arrows and fluxes between those we really don't have a great understanding of. And I think that's one thing we really need to attack intensively with research around the state of Illinois. Again, a quick summary slide. These are titles and specific topics that I've worked on in the past and things that I'm interested in bringing to Illinois and working on. We've got some of these running already, but they're projects that I think kind of collectively address challenges, and they can be tailored to really focus on regional and local specific challenges as well. I think a lot of times we put studies together and let's say we're doing similar treatments or designs, and Jake and I are just talking, Giovanni talked about some studies we're looking at putting in across the state, but also we need to think about regional challenges that different parts of the state have, and how can we design research to be flexible enough to fit soils and cropping systems within different parts of the state, but collectively progress everyone forward. So now I'll go into a few specific examples of projects that I'm working on right now and efforts that collectively kind of fit with the framework that I'm talking about. One of those is working on the database around the state. I'm working with Dr. Nafzinger, looking at how we kind of refine and get to a point where we're continuously updating and understanding how nitrogen or corn yield response to nitrogen within Illinois is changing and fluxing throughout the system. So I've been working with Dr. Nafzinger, Dan Schaefer, John Pikes here, and looking at across the state, how do we kind of rationalize what's been seen over the last really 2 or 3 decades and what that looks like going forward as well. I've been working with the corn nitrogen rate calculator team, worked closely with those faculty for a while in different states. I also serve as the Illinois representative on the Soil Testing and Plant Analysis Committee in the North Central region. So we work kind of within some framework here and are looking at how we can update things to this website, but then what's the future of that as well. I'm really excited about some collaborations with Dr. Guan, who I think just walked in somewhere. But looking at his current NREC funded project and seeing how we can collaborate as well. And some of the outputs are things like probably graphs and figures that you've seen already before, or at least in this kind of framework, where we can take data. This is actually updated through 2024. This includes 2006 data, and we're looking at how that might work and looking at only dropping some older data and looking at newer information. But essentially this framework is kind of in place right now, where it's delivering regional recommendations for nitrogen management, profitable ranges. And I want to continue that theme in thinking about how we align agronomic performance and profitability, but then how can we provide guidance and research findings that are flexible enough? So we're dealing with a current environmental scenario coming into planting season that's a lot different than what we've seen in the past. Can we be adaptive throughout the season? My moonshot, if you will, would be something where we can take information from the 5 to 6 weeks prior to planting and start adapting what we predict to be the nitrogen demand of that crop throughout the season. How does that change when we get our planting nitrogen rates out there? How does that change when we're preparing for our side dress nitrogen rates? I think that's a component and way to think across time how I'm really interested in contextualizing a lot of this work going forward. This is just an example from some of the work that I did in Wisconsin when looking at updating their phosphorus and potassium recommendations. And so this, I think, ties in with the current project that Dr. Margonaut's got going on right now, and I'm having fun collaborating with him as well. This was a big slug of an effort within the state of Wisconsin that I had the opportunity to lead and work on. But what it really did was show the power of getting really expansive field research across the state that we can deliver some relatively timely updates to recommendations and guidance. Within 3 years, we really collected quite a bit of data. This is an example of a relationship between soil test level, corn and soybean relative yield. We identified probabilities of responses across different soil test ranges. And so we contextualize how that research is reported in a way that we can be pretty honest about what we expect, right? We have a soil test level, we have a recommended rate for that. What's the probability of fertilization response at that? Not many states have that identified, and it's kind of, I think, low-hanging fruit to put together for the state of Illinois as well. But we can rationalize this within an economic sense as well, right? That was just kind of an agronomic yield response, and I showed this figure earlier at the Soybean Association meeting this week. This is that same data and information for response to yield and response to ROI for phosphorus fertilizer at different price conditions. So as you move from the left of the screen to the right, we have, we'll say, less favorable price conditions. We know kind of where we're at right now these days. But the break-even point for this data, and it's really just looking at it in a different framework, it does shift a little bit with economics. Not greatly. If we know the variability of soil testing and interpretation, this isn't really, I would say, very different, moving from 25 parts per million or 50 pounds up to 59 pounds. But certainly we see shifts, and I think we can adjust annual management to make sense of what we're seeing in terms of an economic context. And it has importance when reducing phosphorus losses as well in this case. This is an example, I'm sorry, it says P on the title, it should say K. This is an example for potassium as well. And so we can do this same process where we segment out the data, and it really takes, though, a large effort to go through this point and get to the point where we can say we have a fairly high confidence in interpretation of soil tests, for example. So this is just some example of research that I've been involved in and led, and I'm looking forward to collaborating with teams across the state to deliver to Illinois as well. Another component that I really think is interesting, especially as we move across geographies, is integrating, let's say, soil test calibration, for example, with tillage and fertilizer management strategies. How can we have an adaptive guidance or adaptive reasoning to the research that we produce? One of the things that put together so far across the state, putting in last fall or will be going into place in this spring, and I think there'll be some more sites around the state, are initiating long-term phosphorus and potassium calibration trials. So these include different crop rotations, tillages, timings, and placement. The idea is that then we can take this work and say, how do we see different trends across different years? Soil moisture, we can track that with sensors within these systems. There's a lot of opportunity to really dive into some long-term data that I think will be very useful for the state of Illinois in this case. And one of the things that's been exciting about this is just collecting information from people from around the state saying what do we need and how can we address it. The nice thing is if we build a framework of large enough studies that are expansive enough and we put them in place, we can then piece apart and say, well, we want to address this question in this 3-year time frame. We want to address this question. And so they're flexible enough to allow for different research and really just practical questions to come up that we can kind of splice apart these studies to do this. The next question I think that's important that I really like working on is how to prioritize balancing agronomic performance of research and nutrient stewardship. And I'll show one example of some work that I was fortunate enough to be involved in with Iowa. And I see Mariana's in the back there. She might have been at this site up in Northwest Iowa before that had some similar work in our research group at Iowa State. But I think there's studies that show examples of that. We can really balance agronomic performance and production with some type of analysis of nutrient losses. And there's some great examples and case studies of that within the state already, and I'm looking forward to hopefully collaborating across that. So this is an example of where there was continuous runoff monitoring and collection, different tillages, placements, and crop rotations. And from that, we had yield data, and we talked about the actually lack of difference in many of these systems. This was comparing different tillage and phosphorus placements. But then we can take that information and really put some hard numbers to practice efficiencies and loss mechanisms that would really drive those again, practice efficiency numbers within the nutrient loss reduction strategy within the state of Illinois as well. So just kind of a case study that I think this kind of framework is something that I'm really interested in working on and hopefully adding and collaborating to across already started initiatives in the state. So I'll have 2 slides here just to kind of recap and finalize my talk and I would say introduction. I know I'm throwing quite a bit of data and slides at you, but I just want to get maybe a fresh feeling for what I'm interested in and what I'm hoping to bring to the state. This is a 2025 NREC funded project, collaborators with Andrew Margonato and Dr. David Bullock. And we were really looking at ways of assessing nitrogen and cover crop effects on crop yields, not just corn, but soybeans as well, in the context of profitability and some spatial resolution as well across the state. This is using some on-farm experimentation methods where we're essentially cutting up whole fields into checkerboard trials and running different treatments across in terms of a pattern across the state. It's done with production scale equipment and making essentially variable rate prescriptions for the treatments that are assigned within these fields. I'll just have 2 slides to show because we were able to get the treatments in place for the corn crop in 2024. And what we're really looking at here on this figure is the effect of nitrogen fertilization rate. And then each bar, as you progress from left to right, is a different, I'll say, cover crop system. So we started with no cover crops. There were 50 pounds of Austrian peas planted in the fall, 40 pounds of winter barley, and then a mixture of that legume and grass cover crop. The overwhelming nitrogen response, if we just don't consider the cover crop at first, was actually a trend that we saw pretty consistently across last year in different parts of the state, where we probably had some pretty high yielding scenarios where the end demand just wasn't very high. There was a high potential for soil organic nitrogen mineralization and supply. But when you look at the context of the cover crop system, we did see a suppression of yield, especially at those lower rates, but across the board when the barley was in the system. Not so much for the legume cover crop and the Austrian pea. At 50 pounds, when it was applied, it actually wasn't statistically different than the yield with no cover crop at all. However, when we look at the economics of it, this certainly is kind of a story we have to take into context. So if we look at this graph is showing the economic optimum N rate at a price ratio of $5 corn and 50-cent nitrogen. The yield at that nitrogen rate. This is looking then at just some simple, not a comprehensive economic analysis at this point, but looking at the cost of the cover crop seed and then the partial return from the corn yield that was produced at that optimum N rate. And so we do see a shift in reduction of that partial profit when including the cover crops in the system. But I think there's probably some more stories to tell of how can we track some of the nitrogen that's moving through these soils and plants, and that'll be a component that we've started on working on already. And so at least putting some hard numbers on this I think is really valuable, and what we can do with this data is start to piece apart some variability within fields. How can we pull apart soil map units or terrain? Maybe that's important and maybe it's not in certain parts of the state. But this work will be going on in north, central, and southern Illinois going into 2025. These are some other research efforts that I've been involved in, either through collaborations or we've got running already. Certainly would be interested in collaborating with anyone who's interested in working together on these. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is getting around the state to make sure that we have well-represented soils. I'll tell an interesting story that maybe relates to our Southern Illinois folks here. One of my proudest moments in teaching was when I co-coached the Iowa State soil judging team. We had to teach Iowa farm kids what fragipans were in Western Tennessee. That was a lot of fun and understanding subsoil properties. I'm really excited to work on fragic properties and fragipan soils in the southern part of the state, but also just reach around and understand what challenges we have locally that we can address together. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I'll be around most of the day, and here's my contact information if you need it.
And we do have time for questions.
Okay.
Are there any questions for Dr. Jones?
Sure. Yep, Adam. I suppose I should get worried when my boss is going to be asking questions.
No, great presentation. So in the partial return to cover crop slide, one thing that I'm wondering about is whether there are benefits from those cover crops that you might measure to actually include in that analysis. So in a way, you're essentially paying for those benefits. You're getting a similar yield. That analysis might go a little deeper.
Sure. So the question was that, can we take some more sources of essentially cost or partial profit into that calculation? Certainly. That was really only looking at the response to nitrogen, so the optimum rate, the yield at that optimum rate, and the cover crop seed cost. That's not including application costs, and that's not including any. There was a slight reduction in our optimum N rate with the pea cover crop, but not statistically different. I think that's an important thing to contextualize all this. From my research looking at cover crops in the past when doing full nitrogen rates with and without, usually it's been in geographies where soil erosion was the main concern that we needed to address. And there's research on hard data of the yield potential loss over time, over decades of soil erosion, whether on a small scale or a large scale. So I think you can probably project that to a certain extent. I think when in a short-term sense, you can look at what programs are available for cost sharing, and that works into all those budgets. That certainly is not a comprehensive on-farm budget or assessment of cover crops, just kind of off the cuff for the preliminary data. Yep. But I think that's important to consider.
Any more questions? Oh, yep.
Yep.
With some of the optimum N rate stuff and the cover crops and no cover crop stuff, have you seen a bump? You need a higher optimum N rate in those first 3 to 5 years using cover crops before you kind of get over the carbon penalty, I guess, when you first start using them?
Yes. So the question is there a nitrogen surplus in nitrogen demand to overcome? Yeah, I've seen that in 3 different states across the board, especially on those first 3 to 4 years of introducing a grass cover crop before corn production. Now, what'll be interesting in this work, and I think it kind of ties into what I've heard Lowell Gentry talk about before, when there's a system of where you're just putting those grass cover crops before soybean. Does that yield penalty go away, or that end demand penalty go away? We'll be doing that work going forward. So we just had 1 corn field this year, but every year at each site there'll be 2 soybean and 2 corn fields. So I do think that is valuable, and if we can reach our nutrient loss reduction goals by only putting that grass cover crop ahead of soybean, that would be a situation that would work well. But certainly I've seen that higher UNR value time and time again in the first 3 years.